Vinaruz, Spain, 1938. After months of hard fighting, the sight in front of you almost brings tears to your eyes. The Mediterranean Sea stretches out before you, and you have reached it on Good Friday as well. Your fellow Carlist comrades, despite their tiredness and aching limbs, jump for joy or fall to their knees and pray. But for you, there is only one proper way to celebrate. You wade into the water, the welcoming coolness feeling like a revelation from God himself. The Civil War has raged for almost 2 years, but now you have just cut the Republican zone in two. Madrid is now stranded alone in the south, cut off from the red powerhouse of Catalonia. As General Vega dips his fingers in the water and crosses himself, you think back to how this great victory in the warmth of the sun began months before in a frozen hellhole called Teurel. I'm your host, James Barton. Welcome to Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
In the first few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
Damals uns ausgebeten. Wollen wir 4 Jahre Nazi.
Hello everyone, welcome to the show. In the last episode, the Republic wasted its best resources on the battlefields of Brunete and Belchite, throwing men into meat grinders for little gain. Now it faced the grim prospect of Franco overrunning what was left of its northern enclave. Desperate for success to silence the doubters, the Communists would take the biggest gamble of the whole war. After the Battle of Teurel, nothing will ever be the same again. In August 1937, the campaign to conquer the northern enclave finally got off the ground, after being delayed by the Brunete offensive. The capture of Santander had been delegated to the Italians. Mussolini had been increasingly insistent that they were given a chance for glory and to wipe clean the stains of Guadalajara. Franco had tried to stall him, claiming Italian troops weren't, quote, tempered enough, end quote. In non-diplomatic language, that means the Italians would run away again, which went down like a lead balloon with the Duchy. Mussolini threw a fit, threatening to pull out his whole force if they weren't put to good use right this minute, forcing Franco to give in. Santander wasn't an easy target. The port was shielded by a chain of mountains some 50 kilometers from the coast, rising to over 1,000 meters, dissected by 5 passes with good roads, which became the focus of the fighting. Defence was far easier than attack in this harsh landscape, and the Republicans had months to improve their defences, during which time they'd amassed 80,000 men and 180 guns. Finally, on Saturday the 14th of August, the now all too familiar air attacks began, followed by artillery bombardments and wave after wave of infantry attacks crashing against the Republican lines. They soon smashed through the Republican 54th Division. Many of the Republican formations then carried out a fighting retreat into the mountains of the Asturias. The remainder were bottled up in the port of Santander and the small port of Santona. In Santander, the desperation was so great that many men got rip-roaring drunk. Officers had to organise parties of soldiers to go around destroying the wine stocks. The 22,000 trapped in Santona signed an agreement with the Italians which would allow them to surrender or take a ship out of the port. Forever after, this was known in the rest of Republican Spain as the treason of Santona, as many of these soldiers would end up in the Nationalist army. With the subsequent surrender of Santander, the Nationalists had won a truly massive victory. 86 battalions of troops had been destroyed, with 60,000 men taken prisoner. For this massive reduction in Republican forces in the north, the Nationalists would suffer only 3,000 casualties themselves. It was Italy's greatest victory of the war, helping to cleanse the stain of Guadalajara. What was left of the Republican military in the enclave retreated further into the Asturias. Outnumbered and outgunned, the terrain here at least gave them some kind of fighting chance. If they could hold out until winter came, the Nationalists would be stalemated until at least spring 1938. As the clock ticked down mercilessly, one last epic battle for the North would be fought. The Battle of El Mazuco unfolded in the rugged Sierra del Quiera mountain range, near the El Mazuco Pass, a narrow choke point that controlled access to eastern Asturias from the west. It was a landscape of steep, forested slopes that rose up to jagged peaks, with sheer cliffs, deep ravines and boulder-strewn inclines, lying in wait for any would-be attacker. The defenders exploited this unforgiving terrain by fortifying the high ground with trenches, machine gun nests and bunkers. Here, 6,000 poorly armed Republicans, a mixture of Asturian socialist miners, anarchists and what remained of the Basque army, made their stand like modern-day Spartans. They faced 33,000 of Franco's finest, backed by the Condor Legion and masses of artillery. As the battle began on the 5th of September, the defenders had a stroke of luck. The heavens opened, and soon the whole area was shrouded with fog and rain, preventing the Nationalists from using their air power. Instead, their troops had to advance up the steep slopes, straight into the teeth of the Republican defences. This would be some of the most vicious and intense fighting of the whole war, and that is really saying something. The cold wind chills you to the bone, not helped by the icy drizzle that pricks against your skin and soaks your clothes. From a long line of royalist Carlists, you answered the call when the coup occurred, but now you wish you'd stayed on your farm. As you slowly stagger up the steep slope before you, trying not to look at the deep ravine that runs to the right, the fog-shrouded peak of the mountain menacingly looms ahead. You know there must be Reds up there, lying in wait for you. An explosion erupts from near the peak. You were just wondering if it's your own artillery when rocks begin pouring down the slope towards you. What begins as a few small pebbles rapidly turns into larger rocks and then huge boulders hurtling down the slope towards you. The Reds have started a landslide. Panic grips your comrades as they desperately seek cover. Some are crushed by huge stones, while another screams in terror as he is knocked down the ravine. Just as you are recovering from the rock slide, metal barrels come crashing down the slope next, exploding into flames of red and yellow. You're battered and bruised, half deafened by the explosions, but you fire your rifle up into the mist surrounding the peak. Advancing forward with what's left of your brigade, as the deadly machine guns of the Reds open up with their lethal fire. The Republicans really used man-made rock slides and rolled dynamite-filled carbide containers down the slopes. When these failed, much of the fighting was hand-to-hand, bayonet to bayonet, knife to knife. As the fighting ground on week after week, the weather finally cleared. Von Richthofen's Condor Legion began carpet-bombing the mountaintops, even experimenting with a prototype of napalm consisting of cans of petrol attached to incendiary bombs. This new invention led to huge fires on the peaks of the mountains, turning the sky an eerie red at night. Lord of the Rings hadn't been written yet, but from the descriptions by veterans it sounds like a vision of Mordor. So many high explosives were dropped that some of those mountains were probably shorter after the battle ended. The defenders' heroic resistance in dire circumstances delayed the Nationalist offensive by 3 weeks, but it wasn't enough to reach the vital winter months. The The 6,000 defenders at the start had been reduced to under 2,000, as Franco's men captured their mountain strongholds at the point of a bayonet. The final collapse of the north now began. The Republican government in Valencia instructed the remnants of its former northern army to evacuate, but Franco's fleet, waiting for the collapse, asked the Condor Legion to bomb the Republican destroyer Ciscar, sent to take off as many people as possible. The Ciscar sank, and foreign ships were intercepted by the nationalist warships. Many senior officials and officers managed to escape on gunboats and other smaller vessels to France. Yet the bulk of the Republican troops continued fighting ferociously until the afternoon of the 21st of October, when the 4th Brigade entered the city of Gijón. Terror against civilians had always been a nationalist tactic, as we saw at Badajoz and Guernica. Indeed, the nationalist generals often boasted of the need to kill millions of Spaniards to achieve final victory. But the violence now became far more systematic under the radicalizing effect of close to a year and a half of civil war. Franco had been obsessed with a quick victory earlier on, as shown by his obsession with taking Madrid. But now his thinking changed, as he elaborated to his Italian counterpart, quote, "In a civil war, systematic occupation of territory, accompanied by the necessary purges, is preferable to a rapid defeat of the enemy armies, which in the end leaves the country still infested with enemies." End quote. Gijón was the first to feel this change in policy. Phalangists and foreign legionnaires methodically rounded up anyone even vaguely suspected of Republican sympathies. Corralled into the city's bull rings, the sound of machine gun fire went on for weeks as the executioners completed their bloody work. Large crowds of nationalist sympathizers took seats in the bull rings to watch the spectacle. After suffering Red Terror themselves, they screamed abuse at the prisoners and proudly did fascist salutes. It was Badajoz all over again, but on a far larger scale, far better organized, and journalists were kept well away. You had to feel sorry for the Spaniards themselves, caught between nationalist massacres and the paranoid purges of the communists. There would be another 6 months of guerrilla warfare in the mountains, but the Republican enclave had been wiped out. By spring 1938, the troops that had been tied up here were marching south. With them came 100,000 prisoners from the northern campaign, forced into fighting for Franco and kept in line with severe discipline. The end of 1937 was a grim time for the Republic as they faced a far stronger nationalist enemy. For the first time in the war, Franco's forces equaled the Republicans in manpower under arms, roughly between 650,000 and 700,000 on each side, and the scales were to continue moving further in his favour. The conquest of the Asturias and the Basque Country had not only released troops for redeployment in the centre, it also yielded a treasure trove of industrial prizes. The most important were the arms factories in the Basque Country, the heavy industry of Bilbao, and the coal and iron ore of the northern regions, though much of the latter was taken in payment by Germany for its services on Franco's behalf. The Nationalist Army had also been completely reorganised after its amateurish beginnings, with 5 army corps garrisoning the fronts, and the 5 most powerful, including all their elite formations such as the Army of Africa and the Spanish Foreign Legion, organised into the Army of Manoeuvre, which would carry out the offensives of the Nationalists. Its officer corps was now filled with graduates of the German training courses as well. Facing this formidable war machine, the Republic should have gone on the defensive. It could have tied down large numbers of nationalist troops through the guerrilla warfare behind the lines, while bleeding Franco's forces when they attacked. When this was tried by some local commanders, it worked well. The longer the Republic could draw out the struggle, the more chance a wider European war would break out and save them. This isn't just hindsight. At the time, many in the Republican government recommended this strategy. Even their Soviet advisors thought it was a good idea. Sadly, the 2 most important decision-makers disagreed: Juan Negrin, and of course his allies the Communists. Like a broken record, there was only one strategy they were committed to: more massive offensives. They had seized power back in May, claiming only their centralized authoritarian rule could win the war. Instead, they had delivered the bloody disasters of Brunete and Belchite, while the North had fallen. They needed a victory, a real victory this time, to silence the growing criticism and dissent. Their excuse to launch another offensive soon arrived thanks to a daring spy mission. A young anarchist, disguised as a shepherd, slipped across the nationalist lines and discovered from gossiping soldiers that Franco was going to attack Madrid again. Like a dog leaping on a bone, Negrin and the communists immediately began preparing a preemptive strike to distract the nationalists from the capital. Their choice of target was a strange one. By late 1938, the nationalists controlled the west of Spain, and the Republicans controlled the east. But on the Aragon front, a nationalist salient protruded like a narrow spear into the Republican lines, stretching all the way to the town of Teruel. If you see it on a map, it looks like a thin line threatening to cut the Republican sector in two, potentially separating Barcelona from Madrid and Valencia. While it appears menacing on a map, in reality at this stage of the war it was no threat to the Republicans. There were barely any troops here, the nationalists struggling to supply those that were. It had been a quiet front since the early days of the Civil War. It was Teruel that would be the focus of the new offensive, a gloomy and remote town, capital of one of the poorest provinces in Spain, situated high up in the rugged Iberian mountain system. Fortified during the Reconquista to act as a buffer between the warring Christian and Muslim states, it fulfilled the same role now between nationalists and Republicans. It had little strategic value. In the best-case scenario for the Republicans, capturing the city would only make communications slightly easier between Valencia and Barcelona. Why then was it picked? There were two main reasons, both pretty puerile. Firstly, capturing a provincial capital would look good propaganda-wise, quieting the doubters at home and abroad. Secondly, they thought it would be easy, a walkover, just like Brunete and Belchite were meant to have been. The communists had learned nothing from the failed offensives in July and August. Far from being an easy victory, Teruel would mutate into the biggest and bloodiest battle of the Civil War so far. 200,000 men would fight to the death in terrible conditions over the shattered remnants of this small city. Teruel was more formidable than the communists realized. The town was a walled and mountain-ringed natural fortress. It was surrounded by deep gorges, tooth-shaped peaks, and steep valleys, resembling a mouthful of rotten teeth. This was literally the case to the west of the city, which was dominated by the La Muela de Teruel, or Teruel's Tooth Mountain. Adding to the defences created by nature, the nationalists laid barbed wire, built machine gun emplacements, and dug trenches. Logistically, it was a nightmare. The road network was sparse and poorly maintained. It also had the dubious distinction of being the coldest place in Spain, with temperatures regularly sinking to almost Siberian levels in winter. Republican logistics had always been fragile. Now they were going to fight in an area that would challenge even a more professional force. The Republican army itself wasn't what it had been before Brunete. The communists liked to boast they'd been completely reformed, out with the old inefficient militias, and in with centralized control and proper military discipline. The old militias had their glaring faults, it was true, but this new army was far from the well-oiled machine in the propaganda. After the failed offences of the summer, it had lost most of its best equipment, and this hadn't been replaced. Many of its best soldiers had died on the battlefield, replaced by unenthusiastic conscripts. Its reserves of manpower were so low that to find troops for this offensive, they had to weaken the front lines across Spain. Teruel was going to be a huge gamble, but the commanders didn't seem to realize this at the time. They had effectively bet the house on this offensive. If the dice turned up snake eyes, they would be so weakened that disaster could not be far off. Many in the Republican government opposed this whole operation, but they were silenced by a now familiar phrase. That sounds like something a Trotskyite would say. As Stalin's Great Purge in the USSR reached its peak, the madness amped up in Republican Spain as well. Enemies of the communists, both real and imagined, were disappearing every day. The secret prisons and concentration camps were filled to bursting point. At the centre of it all was André Marty, leader of the international brigades, his cronies, and the communist-controlled secret police called the SIM. Soldiers were now being shot for going on leave, accused of desertion. Getting drunk or performing a sloppy salute was enough to get you a bullet in the head. Marty had one poor devil executed for, quote, squinting in a fascist-like manner, end quote. As Marty truly earned his nickname the Butcher of Albacete was the brigade's HQ, he had a new chief henchman. He would turn out to be one of the most dangerous and devious men in all of Spain. George Mink was an American communist and one of Stalin's favourite assassins. Already responsible for numerous murders across Europe and the Americas, he strongly resembled a mob executioner more than a commissar. He loved three things: expensive booze, expensive women, and the finest tailored clothes. Staying well away from the front lines, he took up residence in Barcelona's fanciest hotels. He could normally be found drunk in a hotel bar, flashing large rolls of pesetas, a glamorous Spanish woman on his arm, dressed in suits from London's Savile Row, and offering cigarettes to drinking companions from a solid gold case. He sounds a bit like James Bond, but his dandyish ways had a heart of steel. He organised a reign of terror, kidnapping hundreds of POUM members, anarchists, and, inevitably, suspected Trotskyites, all of whom were never seen again. He earned the burning hatred of his countrymen in the Lincoln-Washington Brigade. 25 members of this brigade asked for his help to go home, assuming they could trust Mink as a fellow American. After luring them into a false sense of security, he had them court-martialed, shot, and buried in unmarked graves. He was never forgiven. As one former brigader recalled, quote, I know that plenty of American loyalists would like to get their hands on George Mink. He was responsible for shooting many Americans in the back over there. End quote. When he was asked one drunken evening how he could commit such acts, Mink smiled coldly and replied, quote, You have to be a Bolshevik, and a Bolshevik would kill his own mother. End quote. Before the madness of Marty and Mink's immoral killing spree, the terrified doubters were forced into silence as the disaster unfolded. The plan for this operation was created once again by General Rojo, whose unenviable track record already included Brunete and Belchite. He was another oddity in the ranks of the Republican forces, a conservative Catholic who resembled a small-town accountant. There is much speculation on why he remained loyal, ranging from a commitment to order to him being a relatively apolitical technocrat who just happened to find himself behind Republican lines when the coup occurred. Personally, I think it was because he never served in the Rif Wars in Morocco. This tended to be the dividing line for officers. Those who fought in the Rif backed the nationalists. Those who had stayed in metropolitan Spain backed the Republic. Like so many of Rojo's plans, the Teruel operation looked good on paper at least. Republican forces would cut off the city from the rest of the salient in a pincer manoeuvre, then fortify their positions against nationalist counterattacks. Another Republican army would then capture the city itself. With 40,000 soldiers and the last reserves of Republican tanks and aircraft, they completely outnumbered the 10,000 defenders under the superbly named Colonel Domingo Rey de Harcourt. For the first time in the war, the international brigades were not going to be the shock troops leading the offensive. They were currently in disfavour, accused of the so terrible crime of cleverism. Named after a brigade officer accused of being too boastful, it was the allegation that the international volunteers were selfishly stealing the limelight from the Spanish troops. The former glorious heroes of Jarama and Guadalajara were now being portrayed as arrogant prima donnas. That's gratitude for you. As a result, Rojo declared this would be solely a Spanish affair. The brigaders would wait in the rear as reserves, at least for now. Snow was falling at dawn on the 15th of December when the 11th Division broke through the weak nationalist lines. a premonition that the worst winter in 20 years was about to descend. The Republican forces achieved complete surprise, mainly because the Nationalist High Command had dismissed reports of a Teruel offensive as laughable. Soon the city was completely cut off, though not without the Republicans getting a bloody nose. Still, by the 19th of December, they had reached the gates of Teruel. Defense Minister Prieto and General Rojo arrived that day to visit the front, accompanied by a large retinue of foreign journalists, including Ernst Hemingway and Robert Capa, waiting for the moment when they could announce to the world that the People's Army had captured a provincial capital for the first time in the war. Little did they know they were in for a wait. On the 21st of December, Republican soldiers and tanks advanced into the city behind a curtain of machine gun fire. Herbert Matthews of the New York Times breathlessly wrote that, quote, "You could make out the Dinametrios running up the first streets and the flashes of their explosive charges exploding inside houses. A great moment had arrived, one of those dramatic moments in history and journalism." End quote. But such excited optimism was badly misplaced. The winter fighting in Teruel rapidly turned into the most horrific of all the battles of the Civil War. The Republicans had to advance up frozen streets, dodging from one pile of rubble to another under Nationalist fire. To avoid the killing zone of the streets outside, soldiers had to fight their way from house to house. The Republicans had to blast their way through walls and floors in the face of Nationalist ambushes and machine gun fire. Civilians cowering in cellars were in just as much danger of being killed or maimed by grenades, or buried in masonry from the explosive charges.
Mientras quieren miliciano, los moros no pasarán, no pasarán, no pasarán.
As you run down the snow-covered street, the howling wind swirling all around you, the fascist guns open up. The soldier to your left catches a bullet in the head, crimson blood spraying out as he falls. Your friend Carlos yells out, "We won't last long out here. We need to get inside one of these buildings." Kicking down a door, you take shelter in the threadbare house. It's barely warmer than outside, but at least you're protected from the bullets and the wind. As you prepare to smash through the wall and advance into the next house, bullets whiz up from the floor. One of your comrades is hit where no man should ever be hit, screaming in agony. Frantically you rake the floor with bullets until the shooting stops. Peering beneath the floorboards, you find a dead nationalist suspended from a beam. As you try to help your wounded colleague, you hear footsteps from upstairs. Turning to Carlos, you shout, "We're not alone in here." But he is already diving for cover as a grenade is thrown down the stairs. Half deafened by the explosion, you see 3 fascists charge down the stairs. One swipes at you with his dagger, slicing your arm. Ignoring the pain, you wrestle into the floor as you both smash into the walls and furniture. Managing to get on top, you turn his hands around, still clutching the dagger, and point it at his heart. Slowly, you push it down into his body. Getting up, your breath coming out in racking coughs, you look at Carlos as he finishes off the last of the enemies. Taking a moment, you just stare at each other. Then he says, "Let's see what the next house has in store for us. No pasaran." The temperature dropped to minus 15 degrees centigrade. There was little water available in the city as the pipes were frozen solid. Furniture was smashed to provide fuel to melt snow, as well as to create some warmth. Fighting continued during the night, with soldiers on either side bayoneting each other in close-quarter combat. Conditions in Stalingrad, just 5 years later, would not be much worse. By Christmas Day, the remaining nationalist defenders were still holding out in 4 key areas: the civil governor's office, the Bank of Spain, the convent of Santa Clara, and the seminary. Impatient for victory, however, the communist-controlled Radio Barcelona went ahead and announced that Teruel had fallen. Promotions and awards were showered down on the high command, especially Rojo. The communists claimed the victory for themselves, of course. Even Prieto suffered an attack of optimism and joked that he was now Minister of Defense and Attack. "You're a real comedian there, Prieto." Yet as they patted themselves on the back, their bemused troops were still fighting in sub-zero temperatures against fanatical nationalist resistance. They had to bring up artillery and fire into buildings at point-blank range, then storm inside with bayonets. They did get some interesting visitors, however. Hemingway, of course, was there, sharing his seemingly never-ending supply of booze and food, while even showing a young soldier how to knock the jam bolt of his rifle free with a rock. Clement Attlee, the British Labour leader and a future Prime Minister, visited the British Brigade, while the famous African-American singer Paul Robeson treated them to a concert, singing everything from the Internationale to Old Man River. There was another foreign visitor at Teruel who would become infamous later on, Harold Kim Philby. Yep, that Kim Philby, the famous Soviet spy who infiltrated MI6. Already a Soviet agent, he had used his pro-fascist father's connections to be sent to Spain as a reporter for the London Times. He was spying on the Germans and Italians in particular, writing fawning articles about the nationalists to win their trust. At Teruel, something happened that would give him access to Franco's inner circle. A car carrying 4 journalists, including Philby, was hit by a Republican shell. The only survivor was the future super spy himself. Decorated with a medal by Franco, he became one of the most important Soviet spies in Spain. I bet the British government and his former colleagues at MI6 wish he'd died there. The offensive at Teruel was like a bolt from the blue from the nationalists, as they had been so focused on Madrid. Franco was now torn between 2 choices. Should he continue with his plan to attack Madrid, as he was counselled by his German and Italian advisers, or should he react to the red cape brandished in his face by the Republicans? To the intense frustration of his foreign allies, Franco could not allow the Republicans to enjoy their minor triumph. The new commander of the Italian Expeditionary Force raged that, quote, "Franco is weak, and always a Spaniard," end quote. While von Richthofen complained that the Madrid offensive had been cancelled, quote, "for reasons of prestige, of a special political nature," end quote. Franco was not a brilliant general, but here he made the right decision. The destruction he would bring down on the Republican forces would win him the war. The terrible weather conditions prevented the nationalists from launching their counterattack until the 29th of December. It opened with the greatest artillery bombardment yet seen in the war, while the Condor Legion dropped 100 tons of bombs on the Republican positions. Yet for all the fury of the bombardment, it did little good. The nationalists gained hardly any ground. Even von Richthofen had to admit, through gritted teeth, that the effect of his bombing was, quote, "not great," end quote. During the 31st of December 1937, 50-mile-per-hour winds shrieked down from the north, bringing with them blizzards that reduced visibility to just a few meters. That night the temperature dropped to below minus 20 degrees centigrade. Engines seized up and not even blowtorches could move them. Thousands of troops suffered frostbite, and some had limbs amputated without anesthetics. Others, having tried to warm themselves with alcohol, died of exposure in their sleep. Republican supply lines buckled under the pressure, with 600 trucks trapped in the snow on the roads leading to Teruel. Nationalist progress remained slow as well, with the Moorish troops in particular suffering terribly in the cold, as they were still dressed for North Africa. Even the Condor Legion was struggling to fly, having to chip ice off the wings of its planes before they could go on missions. On the last day of 1937, The Nationalists briefly fought their way into the city's suburbs, capturing the Tooth Mountain and the Bull Ring, but had to retreat thanks to the cold and Republican resistance. The battle was now like Caesar at Alesia. The Republicans were still besieging the remnants of the original defenders, but now in turn, they were besieged themselves. Sadly for the Republic, they didn't have a general of Caesar's ability to save the situation. That night, the Republicans made a massive error. Major Andres, who had been appointed military commandant of the city, inexplicably ordered his troops to abandon Teruel. The besieged Nationalists do not appear to have realized what had happened, and luckily didn't take advantage. As one bitter official complained, quote, "For several hours, Teruel belonged to nobody." End quote. General Walter had a full-scale meltdown, ranting that it was, quote, "a difficult, panic-stricken day when the Republican forces fled from the front and cleared out of Teruel itself. This was to a significant degree the result of a panic organized by fascist agents among our units." End quote. It was all Trotsky and his followers' fault, comrades, not incompetence. Seriously thinking of using that excuse at home. If my wife complains about an unfinished DIY project, I'll just say it was Trotskyite saboteurs who were to blame. As the fighting was briefly stalemated, the troops on both sides suffered a hellish existence. Blizzards filled their trenches with snow and made movement almost impossible. Troops easily stood out as dark silhouettes against the white snow and became easy targets. On the Nationalist side, everyone was complaining about the Italians. An exasperated von Richthofen complained in his diary that the Italians, quote, "fired from maps and did not observe the fall of shells, which at no point during the attack found their targets." End quote. For the Nationalist defenders, their situation was truly dire, as they had no water, little food, ammunition or medical supplies left. The convent had fallen after its defenders literally fought to the last man. The civil governor's building fell on January the 3rd, after some of the worst fighting of the whole battle. At one point, the attackers and defenders were on different stories of the building and fired at each other through holes in the floor. Though Franco demanded they keep resisting, by the 8th of January 1938, they had reached the limits of their endurance. Rey de Harcourt, with the Bishop of Teruel at his side, surrendered to the Republican forces. Teruel had finally fallen, a full 2 weeks after the communists had claimed it had originally been captured. Rey de Harcourt had done an amazing job of resistance, but he wouldn't be thanked for it. The furious Nationalists denounced him for surrendering, blaming the fall of Teruel on, quote, "the weakness and incompetence of the sector commander, who agreed with the Reds to surrender his post of duty." End quote. He would end up as one of the last victims of the communists, executed along with the Bishop of Teruel as the Republic collapsed. As the weather began to improve and a new counterattack by the Nationalists seemed certain, the pretense of an all-Spanish victory was quietly dropped. The international brigades were rushed in to provide much-needed reinforcements. All charges of nefarious cleverism were dropped for now. But just to show them who was boss, Marty arranged a fearsome demonstration. A mixture of 50 Spaniards and brigaders were accused of desertion and publicly shot at dawn. The message was simple: toe the line, or else. The British, the Washington Lincoln Brigade, and the German Falmans were all there, plus a new force, the Canadian Mackenzie Papineau Brigade, or MAC-PAPs for short. Canadians had been fighting in the Civil War since the Battle of Madrid, but their own brigade had taken longer to form. It had only come together shortly after Belchite, and they took part in some of the fighting that occurred after the main offensive was over. Teruel would be their true baptism of fire. Here they would earn eternal glory, at a terrible cost. Dragged from their positions around Madrid, even getting to Teruel was a lethal enterprise. It was a 9-hour journey in trucks over ice-covered mountain roads, with several vehicles plunging over the cliff, killing or injuring many brigade members before they even reached the front. Along with a force of Brits, Americans, Germans, and Spanish Marines, they held 2 vital strongpoints: the Teruel Tooth in the southwest, and another high point called El Mulaton to the northwest. On January the 17th, 60,000 nationalist troops, backed by artillery and the Condor Legion, fell upon their lines. The Germans on El Mulaton repulsed them after intense fighting, so they hit the Mac Paps and Spanish Marines next. British anti-tank guns lobbed shots over their heads at the enemy, while the Canadians and Marines poured a withering fire into the flag-waving enemy soldiers. Franco's men were hurled back with heavy casualties, and now they made a costly mistake. Due to faulty intelligence, they believed that the Mac Paps and the Spanish Marines had withdrawn from their positions after the fighting. Due to this, they attempted to drive round the rear of the Canadians. 2 squadrons of Moorish cavalry rode past El Mulaton between the Mac Paps and the British. The Canadians' headquarters was located in a railroad tunnel directly in the path of the oncoming horsemen. When they closed in, Captain Smith gathered his force around him and quickly ordered 3 heavy machine guns into action, stopping the nationalist charge cold in a maelstrom of screaming horses and falling men. Survivors had no choice but to run the gauntlet of fire from the Canadians and British as they beat a hasty retreat. The defence by the Brigaders and Marines had been awe-inspiring, but they took heavy casualties. As further offensives smashed into their ranks, they couldn't hold out any longer. The Germans were driven off El Mulaton, and the Mac Paps were then hit with everything the Nationalists had. One survivor recalled, quote, "The end had come. Mechanized might and overpowering numbers finally told. Our machine guns were all blown to pieces. We were under fire from nearly every side, and no more reinforcements could reach us, as the hill to our right had been taken. There was only a handful of us left, and our only arms were rifles. We had to make a decision. It was time for retreat. Carrying a wounded man, 5 of us, the last of the living, stumbled out to make a run for it. One of us was killed, and with him the wounded man. We 4 finally made it. We took up a position well to the rear of the hill and waited for the enemy to take over. But we waited a long time. He was taking no chances that some of us might still be there. But he occupied the hill at last, and with that, ended the defence of Outer Teruel." End quote. With the Nationalists at the gates of the city, the Communists ordered counterattacks, but they were asking far too much of their exhausted men. They were almost out of ammunition due to the difficulties of resupply. They had received very little food and had to eat snow as there was no drinking water, nor wood for fuel to melt it. Only in Teruel itself could wood be found, stripped from houses. The counterattacks achieved little except to further wear down the Republican forces. On the 5th of February, the death blow came. As Republicans focused on Teruel itself, the Nationalists attacked their thinly held lines to the north of the city. They had 100,000 men and 500 artillery guns, but their secret weapon would turn out to be horses. In the last battle-winning cavalry charge in modern warfare, the Monasterio 1st Cavalry Division smashed through the Republican lines. The Republican troops manning this part of the front had never seen action before. Ill-trained conscripts with low morale, they fled before the horsemen. The Nationalist formations then swung south in a scything motion, seeking to cut off the Republicans in Teruel. It was a desperate time for the Republicans. They took 20,000 casualties, 7,000 men were taken prisoner, and a huge quantity of arms and equipment were lost. On the 19th of February, the Nationalists cut the Teruel-Valencia road, leaving El Campesino's 46th Division surrounded in the city. At dawn on the 22nd of February, the last Republicans slipped out, trying to break through the Nationalist lines. The triumphant Nationalists marched in. The Butcher's Bill was horrific. The Nationalists took 40,000 casualties, the Republicans 60,000. Teruel was an unmitigated disaster for the Republic. They sacrificed a large part of their best troops and most of their remaining equipment for no purpose. The pathetic state of the survivors and their demoralization and exhaustion would lead to an even greater disaster in just a matter of weeks. The British poet Laurie Lee, who was there to witness the rise and fall of Republican hopes, summed up the Battle of Teurel in the following words, quote, "The gift of Teurel at Christmas had become for the Republicans no more than a poisoned toy. It was meant to be the victory that would change the war. It was indeed the seal of defeat." End quote. The communists had their own ideas of who was to blame for the disaster. Can you guess who? That's right, Trotskyite saboteurs, comrades. In particular, they turned on Prieto and Rojo. They soon began whispering in Agrin's ear that the defeat occurred because Prieto had been, quote, distancing himself from the communists. End quote. A Soviet advisor reported to Moscow that the failure at Teruel was due to Trotskyite fascist agents and, quote, the erroneous or treasonous conduct of the general staff, Rojo in particular. End quote. They were setting the scene for another power grab and a purge of their enemies. The generals were at each other's throats in Teruel, with accusations of treachery, cowardice and incompetence thick in the air. Lister now refused to obey any order from Rojo. El Campesino claimed that Modesto had deliberately left his division to be cut off in Teruel, while Modesto and Lister now hated each other so much they couldn't even be in the same room or have a telephone call together. As the Republican leadership fought among themselves, they took their eye off the ball and didn't notice the moves the nationalists were making. They assumed that Franco would now attack Madrid, and this was precisely what his foreign advisers wanted. The Franco of 1936 and early 1937 would have done this, but now in 1938 he had learnt his lesson. He had a new target in mind, advancing from the recaptured Teruel and driving towards the Mediterranean, cutting the Republican zone in two. Thanks to reports from his spies, he knew just how weakened the Republican army was at the moment. Its best units had been decimated, its last stocks of equipment destroyed, and fatally, there were no reserves left. The troops standing between Franco and the sea were demoralized and had little food, ammunition, or medical supplies left. The relentless Franco lost no time in striking while the iron was hot, assembling an army of 150,000 men, backed by 700 guns and 600 aircraft. On March the 9th, the nationalist campaign opened with a massive ground and air bombardment. By the time the nationalist infantry reached the Republican trenches, their occupants were hardly in a state to hold a rifle, let alone fight. The superiority of nationalist artillery, to say nothing of the Condor Legion, left the Republicans at a total disadvantage. This campaign also saw the Jonker 87, the soon-to-be infamous Stuka dive bomber, in action for the first time. Luftwaffe officers in Spain claimed they could drop its load within 5 meters of a target. Those Republican defenders who endured such bombardments then had to face German tanks using blitzkrieg tactics. There had been attempts to do blitzkrieg at Guadalajara and Brunete, but both failed for reasons we've gone into before. Now, though, blitzkrieg was finally done properly. The fast-moving German tanks relentlessly raced past the Republicans, getting around their flanks, cutting them off, and forcing them to change direction repeatedly, while panicked Republican soldiers, retreating in vehicles, would shout to their weary, demoralized comrades, trudging rearward on foot, that the fascists were right behind them. The Condor Legion ruled the skies, and they shot up everything that moved.
They said it would come, the end of days, when the earth would burn in the viral blaze. Not from fire, not from stone, but from the flesh we call our own. It's the reckoning, the fall man, a prophecy written in blood.
Your truck speeds down the bumpy road, passing a sea of tired, foot-slogging infantrymen, all of you trying to flee the advancing fascists. Then you hear a sound you have already learnt to fear beyond all others. A fleet of planes, lethal black specks in the sky, dive towards your convoy and the fleeing men. They make a horrifying screaming sound, like a monster from hell that has just been released. Soldiers run in terror, trying to get out of the way of their lethal cargoes. It seems that they will smash into the ground, but then they release their bombs and jerk up again into the sky. Men disappear in explosions of red and yellow, while the truck in front of you leaps up into the air in a cloud of black smoke. Your driver frantically tries to dodge the now destroyed truck as more bombs fall all around you, the sound of explosions shattering your eardrums. All around is carnage, destroyed vehicles, dead and wounded men, those left unscathed, fleeing for their lives. You are thanking the stars that you survived the bombs, when you see tanks on the horizon, racing to cut off your retreat. German tanks. Nationalist infantry casualties were the lowest of any major offensive during the war. In fact, after the May bombardments, the Foreign Legion had little to do except bayonet the shock survivors in their trenches. The shell-shocked Republican generals and the Communists were unable to stop the collapse of the front. Instead, they spent their time blaming each other and, of course, Trotskyite saboteurs for the coming disaster. General Walter, in particular, raged that it was all because of the, quote, immense and intensive activity and work of defeatist elements and agents of the fifth column within Republican units. Those were the days of the most stinking, fetid, treacherous activity by all the scum of all shades and colours flourished the most, especially the Trotskyite saboteurs. End quote. Those Trotskyites, you know, always causing trouble. In a bitter irony, the ruins of Belchite fell to the Nationalists on the 10th of March. The so-called Great Communist victory there had been for nothing. Any defensive line which the Republicans patched together crumbled almost as soon as it was formed. The International Brigades tried to stop the deluge, delaying the Nationalists at towns such as Lechera and Capi, but their losses were staggering. The majority of the British battalion were killed, including their famous commissar, Walter Tapsell, or taken prisoner. Barely 80 men reached safety. The Washington Lincolns were decimated, with their top leaders Robert Merriman and David Doran captured and executed by Franco's men. Only 20 Mac Pats escaped from the Nationalists. While the brigades were rebuilt again, they would mostly be filled with teenage Spaniards of dubious reliability and motivation. There was little of their original international character left. This whole period now earned the nickname of the Retreats. In a piece of truly black humour, a flailing General Lister accused Marty of being a Trotskyite. An outraged Marty said he was above suspicion, as he had accused so many others of being Trotskyites. The real saboteur was Lister. As they bickered, both men began shooting retreating soldiers to prove they weren't traitors. It became something of a competition that Marty inevitably won, boasting that he had shot hundreds of troops to stop the retreat, compared to Lister's poor numbers. He left out the fact that this did nothing to stop the Nationalist advance. After April the 1st, the retreat became a rout, alone or in small groups. Republican soldiers and brigaders tried to evade Nationalist patrols and aircraft to make it safely across the Ebro River to Morro de Ebro and safety. A Soviet advisor lamented to Moscow that, quote, a large part of the army which survived the fascist offensive, the overwhelming majority of whom were officers and commanders, were confounded and seized by panic, lost their heads and fled to the rear." End quote. 1 or 2 brave stands were made, but demoralization quickly set in, as the Republicans saw that they were incapable of resisting the Nationalist onslaught, either on the ground or from the air. On April the 15th, Good Friday, Carlist troops reached the coast. They waded into the sea or prayed on the beach, while General Alonso Vega dipped his fingers into the water and crossed himself for the press and cameras. One nationalist boasted that the end of their crusade was near because, quote, "the victorious sword of Franco had cut in two the Spain occupied by the Reds." End quote. The Republic now had less than a year of life left. Thank you for listening. To help the podcast grow, please like, leave a review, or tell a friend. In the final episode of our series on the Spanish Civil War, we'll cover the doomed Ebro offensive, the fall of the Republic, and the triumph of Franco. See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.